I say that is because the reality is some of us, I think we live on two spectrums, or we only know two spectrums in life. One is it's surrounded with cotton candy and lollipops, all right? And little birds that fly around our head and it's always happy. And the other side is just complete mayhem and stressed out. The reality is that's not always going to be the case. Is that fair, church? The reality is it's not always going to be perfect. So even when we put margin in our life, you have to understand and allow God to put margin in our life. It's not always going to be beautiful. But when times come and it gets difficult, there will be room and space to breathe. Jesus says this in John 16:33. He says, I have told you these things so that in me you will have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have come to overcome the world. Isn't that interesting that Jesus puts out there the fact that you're going to have trouble, I'm going to have trouble. And it's going to suck time, it's going to suck energy, it's going to feel as though that things are getting tight in your life. But Jesus says, you know what? I brought something, and that is peace that you can have. You see, the third thing I think of when we talk about why do we need margin is because I want us to know this, is that we have to make our own margin. You have to make your own margin. I learned through the last few years in particular that most people don't think of other people's time. You track with me. My problem is really important, just let me tell you. And your issue is really important. You want to share that. You see, Jesus talks about this, though, with his disciples. In Mark 6:30-31, it says, listen, this is so interesting. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Listen to this. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, he said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. Isn't that interesting? Is that ministry, church, hear this, ministry was happening. People were being healed, people were being fed, right? The homeless are getting homes, people are coming to know who Jesus was, and all the great things are taking place. And you know what the disciples, they didn't even have time to eat. And notice what Jesus didn't do. He didn't say, run through the drive-thru, grab a couple burgers, bring a bag, and feed everybody and get back to work again. He didn't go pick up the $5 pizza, distribute it quickly for all the people. And the disciples, he says, you know what, let's get away and get some rest. That's what Jesus has to offer. The problem is this culture doesn't offer that to us. They're not always looking out for your best interest or my best interest, your time or my time. We don't always have someone in our life to say, you know what, you need to slow down, you need to take some rest. But see, creating our own margin can be difficult for a lot of reasons. And I think there's a wide variety of reasons why we sometimes don't step back and take a deep breath and get rest. But can I share with you a little confession what it's most difficult for me? It's because there's times when I look at things and it seems as though it's because I'm afraid I might upset somebody. I might let somebody down. Does that make sense? Like if someone calls you and asks for your help or asks for your assistance and they really need help, right? They really need someone to talk to. They really need someone to bring them a meal. And if you say no, we're afraid that what? It's going to be negative. That they're going to think badly of us. You know what's interesting that Jesus did here? Jesus said it's okay to step away and allow the people to be the people for a while. It's okay to say no. You see, we're going to talk about that in a minute. I'm really not good at that. I'm really not good at that. And the reason why, when we see this, that we need to create margin is because no one else is going to naturally look out for your margin. The world wants the greatest return out of you for the littlest amount of investment. And the reality is Jesus is the opposite. God is wanting to pour as much into you as possible to allow that little bit of the glory that comes out of you to grow and expand His kingdom. And so I encourage you, when we think about the why, the third was we have to make time for our own margin. So now we come to this point and we say how. Like, how do we create margin in our life? Like, how do we do that? If it's biblical and it's important, how do we do that? The first thing is this, is we need to put some space in our schedule. This is a biblical command, a directive, not a suggestion. In Exodus, we see in Exodus 29-10, it says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Now, some of you grew up with understanding the Sabbath like in a very religious way, and like almost more than the Jews even held it. And that's not what God is intending. I want to tell you this, is that I'm growing to understand this more. It's very difficult for me. But I want to tell you this, some of you have grown and been taught that Sabbath, and we're going to talk about this next week in depth, and we'll come back. But talk that Sabbath is that you just are supposed to do nothing that day. Do nothing, all right? Not really, okay? The point of Sabbath was for you to step back and connect with God. That's the point of Sabbath. And for some of you, it maybe is taking a nap. But men, let me tell you, your day of Sabbath does not merely include a lazy boy and the TV remote, all right? That's not Sabbath, that's a nap. Sabbath is taking time away to connect with God. This year, we planted a garden, all right? I have 21 tomato plants, all right? We're going to have a harvest. That's the goal, right? And I have to tell you, like, I begin seeing that when I mow the lawn and I'm outside, I don't even really like mowing the lawn, but I can go out and mow the lawn and just the hum of the lawn tractor and I just kind of do my thing. Like, it's a time that's away from my normal thought process, and an opportunity to just listen and hear what God has to say. And I know it maybe is revolutionary to you, or maybe it's new news. I don't sit around all day reading my Bible. Okay, like that's not what every pastor minister does. Yes, there's some days that's what it involves when you're getting away and listening to God. But sometimes listening to God, man, can be merely going and sitting in your tree stand during the season, not poaching, all right, during deer season, and just taking in what God has to offer and what God has to speak to you. Sabbath is meant to create space in your life so you can hear what God is saying to you. It's interesting that the Sabbath deal and honoring it, it's clear back in the narrative of creation. See, God created the earth in how many days? 6. On the seventh day, He rested. I remember little, I was like, man, He must have just been wore out, right? That's a lot of work. Done all these things, made all these things, even dinosaurs. Like, He's got to be tired. God wasn't tired physically. He was teaching us a biblical principle of Sabbath, of rest, of going away from what you do on a daily basis to be and to just be. And we're going to come back to this next week on the idea of spiritual margin, and look more deeply into this connection with God. So I throw it out there to you. The first is put some space in your schedule. Second, prune some activities. I talked to a guy this last week who plays softball 4 days a week, and he does a travel softball team on the weekends. And he works 60 hours a week. All seriousness aside, his wife won't be around long. And the reality is because activities can be a good thing, right? And some of you are like, well, I don't do that. Well, some of you bowl. Some of you are in softball leagues. Some of you are in scrapbooking, right? Which I don't understand. It just makes a mess. But I understand it can be cool for some, all right? And all these different activities and things that you have going on. But the reality is that sometimes we go and we do and we have more and more taking place and our schedules begin to overlap. I'm struggling with this because I'll have people that will call and they say, hey, Nate, you know what? I want to know if we can get together. I'm like, yeah, I have time from 1 to 1:15 on Wednesday. That did no one any good, all right? Because they show up at 1:10, right? And the other appointment showed up at 1:10, and now everyone's hanging out at the same time, and we're not being any productive at all. Get rid of some of the activities. Create space in your schedule so that you have more time for those things. As parents, we end up, and maybe you don't live this way, but there's times that we have, where we go and go and go, and we shove chicken nuggets in the kids' mouths in the car on the way down the road. You know what I'm talking about? So you can get to whatever you're going to. And so they still have some food inside them, right? And we just keep going and going and going rather than stepping back and stretching the schedule out and eliminating some things. So this week I want to give you a take-home assignment real quick, but this point is it's okay this week to say no to something. And I want to tell you that my wife's probably sitting here today thinking, man, he really did write a sermon for himself, okay? Because I'm not good at these things. But the more I've been studying, the more I've been reading, like it's essential. It's essential for us to have margin in our life. And it's okay to say no to something. So if you call someone in the church this week and say, hey, I'd really like to get together and talk, and they tell you no, it does not mean they're a bad person. It means they took their homework assignment literally, right? And so I encourage you, say no to something. Thirdly, this morning, how do we create margin? We need to trust God more. Trust God. I have to say, as a confession, there's sometimes I get wrapped up in the fact that Nate needs to be somewhere and be there, because if I'm not there, it's not going to happen. Does that make sense? And I just want to encourage you to know that, you know what, when the world spins, and it keeps spinning, and if Nate dies or you die and we become earthworm food, guess what? The world keeps spinning. The kingdom of God continues to go whether we're here or not. Do we get that? And that's something I need to understand and trust God more, because the reality is when Nate's not at an appointment and somebody else is, or we say no to something, guess who's still in control? God. Guess who we need to put trust in for that? That's God. So how do we do this margin thing? We trust God more. We trust God more. Because God doesn't need us to accomplish any of His work. He includes us in that. He includes us in it. As the worship team comes, I want to share this with you this morning. I got to text my uncle this morning. My Uncle Al, on Thursday, he's 46, Wednesday, he was 46. He had chest pains. Does it sound familiar? He was at work working, and that's what you do at work. But anyways, he was there working, and works at John Deere's. And he was there, and he said, I have some chest pains. The guy said, you all right? He's like, oh, I have chest pains. And he's like, you okay? He's like, oh, I'm fine. Well, it came time in the maintenance department to pull some wrenches, and Al said, I need you to pull that wrench for me. He says, because my arm hurts. And he says, your arm hurts? He says, well, actually, both my arms hurt. He says, is you still having chest pains? He goes, oh, a little bit. It's more in my back now. And he says, well, why don't we get in the truck? I'm going to take you to the hospital. I said, I'm not getting in the truck. I'm not going to the hospital, right? Because men, we only go to the doctor if what? We're in the ambulance. That's the only way we're going to the doctor, right? And all of a sudden he says, well, I'm going to call an ambulance then. And my uncle said, okay, that's fine. You can do that if you want. And he calls an ambulance. I think my uncle was thinking, I don't have to get in that thing, right? But when you have chest pains and your arms are hurting, they put you in the ambulance. You really don't have a choice, right? They get there and the guy to the hospital, and they hooked him up, and they found out his blood pressure was like 220 over 140. And found out that he was having a heart attack. And they got him hooked up, and everything's got him settled down a little bit. The doctor came in, they ran scans, they ran all the checks, all the ins and outs. And they found out that, he says, I don't think you're a candidate for stents. He said if we had to do stents, probably 12 to 15 stents we'd have to put in your veins and stuff. He says, I think we're going to need to do quadruple bypass surgery. I think you're a great candidate for that. That is not what you're going to hear from the doctor, right? A great candidate. You're going to be a great candidate for something else besides quadruple bypass. And so he went into surgery on Friday morning. They got in and found out actually they didn't do 4 bypass, they ended up doing 5 bypass. And got him all hooked up and back and going. And Saturday had him up and walking, all right, which is nuts to me to think he opened up, redone things, and up and walking. But I have to tell you, church, I believe this, that my uncle is a really good guy. He really is. He's a hardworking individual. But his health and stress just is what it's about. Doesn't look over the idea of putting margin in his life. And I have to tell you, church, I want you to know, if you do not put margin in your life, someone is going to. Or something will. Something will. And I'm learning that is that when I don't want margin, guess who puts it in puts it in there? God. He draws the line and says, you know what, you're going to stop now. That's the way it looks. And so I encourage you this morning, church, I'm excited about this message series for 2 reasons. One is, I believe if we have margin in our life, have God put margin in our life, biblical margin, our relationships will be healthier, our opportunity for spiritual growth will be larger, our opportunity for engaging those who are lost is going to be greater, and the opportunity for, most importantly, opportunity for hearing God will take place. The greatest lie that Satan tells us is that you don't need margin in your life. And when we buy into that, the greatest defeat that can take place is we end up not hearing God. We don't even end up listening to God. We just live our life, and we get to a point in our life, and we look back and say, man, I did a lot of things, but what are they worth? Was it really what God asked of us? And I have to tell you, I share that with you because I'm at a point right now in my life that there's a lot of change taking place. A lot of change. And I know the reality is if I do not apply a lot of this biblical principle to my life, allow God to apply it to my life. The reality is I'll look back on life 25, 30 years from now and go, really? Like, did I even really listen to God? Or did I just do kind of godly things? Does that make sense? So church, this morning, if you would, we're going to sing a song about Jesus coming and dying and saving us. And I just want to encourage us over this next few weeks, text in, really try to create margin in your life. Allow God to do that and listen to what He's saying. We stand. This is